already started.
Okay, all right. So good afternoon. The artist would like me to read the following comments. Thank you for coming. It's cool you're here. Please no flash photography. Please no courtroom sketches. Thank you to her 3 friends who came today. Thank you to a bunch of students who are only here because they need extra credit. And thank you to her assistants who had to be here. And this talk is entitled The Horrors of Consciousness and Ethics of Suffering. All right, everyone be cool. Okay. So Dr. Zooey Sophia Pook is going to introduce her talk.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis ravi de présenter mon acte. H.P. Lovecraft begins The Call of Cthulhu with the following words. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. Indeed, we were not meant to venture far in terms of our understanding of the universe. What a cold, indifferent, and hostile terrain we find ourselves, and in a finite and vulnerable form. Much of philosophy has been concerned with the matter. Is it better to know or not? In colloquial terms, is ignorance bliss? Socrates argues that it is not, that fulfillment and meaning come from thoughtful reflection and deliberation, and the happiness of the soul is what matters. Something much deeper than momentary bodily pleasures. John Stuart Mill famously noted, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Continuing the argument against any kind of meaning in rudimentary bodily pleasures, arguing for an ethics beyond pleasure and pain. But it was Nietzsche who warned there were consequences in the pursuit of wisdom, of knowing, warning that philosophy was a pursuit for healthy, young, and well-strengthened individuals, and not for the weak or weary. Because if you peer long into the abyss peers back into you. Do not voyage far from ignorance. To know is dangerous to your health. Consciousness is perilous. And we live in an age of knowing. Infinite answers are at your fingertips or at your voice recognition. And I'm, of course, referring to the internet, the vast system of information which surrounds us and we emerge through. Gen Z, that's you guys, literally grew up and found themselves through the internet and social media. It is an orientation. We learn, we share, we date, we discover through it. We can't, find the nearest Starbucks either, despite it being right across the street at all times. We are trapped in knowledge, in consciousness, left without self-discovery. The answers all around us. Consciousness is our very environment. There is no difference between place and thing any longer, always plugged in a terrain of infinite knowing. And for it, I'm told, this new generation are more woke. Cool. But it doesn't sound like wokeness is all that great. Suicide is up 70% for girls and 25% with boys, with severe increases in anxiety and depression. I guess being aware of climate change, police brutality, the perils of overpopulation, super diseases, and a slew of ongoing oppressions 2,000 years after Christ would not make for a happy human. Nor would being omnipresently the subject of others' attention, ridicule, and judgment, as is the case with our internet identities on social media. We are all only avatars. The internet is a terrifying spectacle, an endless enclosure of jouissance, the permanent threat of future gratification. It is like BDSM, really, edgy. Socrates once feared what the new technology of writing in his time would do to human memory. Well, imagine the internet then speaking back to us, processing our likes and dislikes, storing our data, and then reimagining them through endless chains of advertisements and links and possibilities to keep us clicking and clicking in our human maze, while our identities and desires are constant monetization. You all work for free. No combination of possibilities will ever lead to our fulfillment, nor can it yet give us to the code to the universe, but someday perhaps. And perhaps reality itself, to know everything. For all of the horrors of the universe to be collected and dispersed, infinite knowing. And perhaps then infinite life, a technological singularity of experience, human and internet as one. You get the iOS updates to your brain, so the first couple months are shaky with the bugs or whatever. Thanks, Apple. Your brain downloaded and your consciousness trapped forever in the network, or perhaps a technological shell. This is the plot of the robot movie Chappie. And alas, in Chappie, as in much of society in theory, it is celebrated. Why, I don't know. It's quite out of step with human experience historically. Consciousness is something we'd like to escape. Just think about what you do on a Friday night. Nobody parties, okay. You are Gen Z, you're just on social media. That would have killed with an older crowd. You see, consciousness has been no gift to human existence. And this probably begins with and largely centers around the idea that we are going to die, and living with this knowledge is no small feat. That's why so much of human civilization has centered around religion. We want to believe that we don't really die and that we live on somehow. You see, this downloading your brain thing isn't such a new idea. It sounds a lot like your soul going on. Or at the very least, we want to believe we didn't just live for no reason. And it is a burden that human animals alone have to deal with. Other animals don't have any sense of futurity. They don't know that they will suffer, die, and decompose, perish, as if they were never here at all. They don't have to think about their lovers leaving one day, or their children growing up, replacing them, and then dying too. And most importantly, they don't even know what is happening when they are listening to Nickelback. No, in fact, they don't know evil whatsoever, because evil is a problem of consciousness. Consciousness treats us to a double kind of victimization, the crime and knowledge of it. To hear Nickelback and then remember hearing it. Human beings have it very bad. To be aware you are rotting and that this is your plight is a remarkably difficult phenomenon indeed. Consciousness is not a pretty thing. To be aware of sickness and heartbreak and death, poverty, crime, it makes sense that so many seek higher answers, do drugs, drink, overeat, oversex, watch Riverdale. True torture. True torture. There are too many brain cells in there anyway. What kind of favors are they doing? Why am I here? What is a good life? Will I be remembered? Do I matter? Are best left to healthy, ambitious young people to fumble over. And now that you're all properly depressed, a quick poll. How many of you chose to be born? I'm kidding. A little anti-natal humor for you. There is a very nice cinematic moment in The Bride of Frankenstein. 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. Go watch it. That was a good one. The monster needs a mate. Of course, even the patriarchal monogamy for monsters. So a plan is hatched to force Dr. Frankenstein into making a female monster to hang out with the first monster, who through consciousness now realizes he is alone in the world and is miserable, aren't we all? The catch is the female monster wants no part of this, and upon learning she is made for another, lets out a blood-curdling scream, one of the greatest cinematic moments, I'll let you know, that really should stand in for consciousness itself. Certainly a poignant moment of feminist resistance. And we all are made for another. And no matter what we do, we cannot escape our finite fate. We can do whatever we like to fill our time, but each act only requires another to fulfill us once more, because death is inevitable and the only truth. The Frankenstein monster at this point has the shocking revelation of how absurd and utterly pointless it has all been, and proclaims, "We belong dead," and sets the castle on fire. Fuck. Go watch it, though. But anyway, we are all the monster, or consciousness is a monstrosity. Just think, at some point your parents were so bored with each other as friends, they had to have you. The Frankenstein monster is, of course, not the only historical figure to hold a stoic view of life. that we should not try to escape our fate. Or more specifically for this lecture, not avoid consciousness, but face the reality of our human condition. Freud, the aforementioned Nietzsche, and then the Stoics are also useful examples of Stoicism. It's a good one. I would argue the biggest detriment towards our acceptance of consciousness and our human condition of mortality would be our species' strong penchant towards narrative. We have this very elaborate, I would dare call it extra, nature to invent, explain, and imagine reality through story. We can't just let it be. Stories about right and wrong, stories about God, stories about meaning, about family, about culture, about how cool having money is and going to the club. And I don't think that any of these concepts are all too good. Hard work, dedication, hustle, John Cena, America. These are stories often referred to as ideologies, which we all emerge through and against, producing expectations of any number of things such as offspring, work, certain behavior, particular beliefs, and that's where the whole racism, classism, sexism stuff comes in, because we insist on measuring people by these fakakta stories. Shout out to Pook. Deceitful, stupid stories that overemphasize our worth. Unsustainable lunacies such as that the earth is infinite and made for our consumption, or that science can help us endure our tragic missteps in civilization. No, it isn't easy for us to think that the cosmos not only doesn't exist for us, but could care less if we are here, and oftentimes are outright inhospitable. And because we couldn't remember that, Lovecraft wrote endless tales to remind us, in which black goo and unthinkable creations emerged to remind us that human life was never at home and never belonged here. And we see all kinds of catastrophes from the earth all the time. David Lynch's movies such as Wild at Heart, Inland Empire, and Blue Velvet are also evidence of the constant threat of a weird, hideous, and unbearable truth constantly ready to break right through the appearances of a neat and civilized human social experience. But I guess stories about how important we are and how we might live on as souls or robots or through true love or family legacies are more exciting to most. You choose, I guess. I very much enjoy Carlo Michelstaeder's work for this reason. In his work, Persuasion and Rhetoric, he addressed the problem of consciousness all too clearly. Most of us live in what he terms rhetoric, false personal and social ideas, or stories we choose to live in lieu of accepting our human condition, hard work, family, capitalism, etc. Persuasion is thus the opposite, a kind of actualization or self-possession through stoicism in which we accept that all stories are bullshit. I can go make bank, bruh, and work hard, or worship God, or have a family and pass down my legacy, but these are all just stories because I will die. I am finite. The material truth is my consciousness will cease, and with it my story, and so will yours, etc. Our human history is that of every other species. We rot. So we should not live in an idea of ourselves or a story. And I, for one, don't think our human stories are particularly good or ethical. Anyway, if I can walk down the street and see a homeless man suffering and say, well, should I give him $1? No, he'll only spend it on booze. That's pretty messed up. The only thing that stops a bad man with a gun is a good man with a gun. Yet there have been over 150 mass shootings this year, and there are over 300 million guns. So I don't think your uncle, who thinks he is Batman or whatever, is doing a particularly good job. What a bunch of pompous, sanctimonious assholes we all are. I think we'd be much better off ditching the narratives and embracing our shared human condition. And that's that we are finite creatures who will suffer a lot. Heartbreak, death, illness, injury, hunger, loneliness, etc. We are rotting. We are born to die. We are fragile. There's no need to endure more suffering. Our ideologies, our cultural stories, these human myths aimed at avoidance of our very certain fates of death, which divide us, Christian, atheist, American, illegal, Democrat, Cheeto, which cause strife between us, which multiply human suffering. I'm not for them. These stories often benefit ourselves at the expense of others. Our ethical ideas have come too far from the source if they'd allow mistreatment, sacrifice, hunger, murder, or suffering. And I would have to disagree with the privileged pronouncements of Socrates or anyone else who downplays our phenomenological experience. Suffering is not romantic. It is not a story either. It is reality, the only reality. We are weak. Perhaps you could accuse me of hedonism, but what I think is necessary now more than ever as our species faces climate change and probably catastrophe because of those fantastic stories about our human importance, some that may have even tricked us into thinking we could overcome death, is an ethics of suffering. To realize that life is suffering. It is death. Let us begin from fact and not fiction. We rot. We disappear from existence. And to sprout forth a politics that follows, which ignores ideological difference and crosses party lines, recognizing our shared condition of fragility, and begins to face some of those problems of consciousness. How do we make our lives and others better? How do we reduce harm? How can we treat each other well despite the fact that our lives are impermanent and we will all be sick, suffer heartbreak, and die? We cannot escape them. I want to strongly reject a false dichotomy between an emerging neo-fascism that falsely equates survival and well-being to intolerance, and also to a liberal identity politics which is steeped in a classist ethos that champions difference only so long as it meets its own moneyed standards of fashion, race, and education. The most unbearable of us, prisoner, war victim, transgender, refugee, drug addict, are suffering and left without recourse. We need an equity of difference rooted in an understanding of human mortality, and that is passionate against suffering in all varieties of forms. We all share the same condition. We all suffer. You cannot run from it. And because we are here already, most of us locked into this existence, a raw deal, by a kind of fail-safe that prevents otherwise, I am calling for an acceptance of fate. Let us come together and create a new world in our human image. A new ethics and a new way of being first requires a new conception of humanity. We suffer. This should be our first concern, and it is the only sincere pursuit. Merci.